1967, a motorcycle built in a tiny village in England outsold every other imported bike in the United States. 28,000 of them. Faster than the Harleys, lighter than the Harleys, and America knew it. Marlon Brando rode one. Steve McQueen preferred them. Bob Dylan nearly killed himself on one. For 15 years, one factory in the English Midlands built what many riders believed was the greatest motorcycle in the world. Then the people running the company made a decision so catastrophically stupid it destroyed the entire British motorcycle industry. This is the story of how Britain conquered America and then handed it to everyone else. Act 1. The man who built the formula. To understand how Britain won America, you have to start with one man. Edward Turner arrives at the Triumph Engineering Company in 1936. 35 years old, no formal degree, self-taught. He pushes out the senior engineer already on the team and brings in his own man, a designer named Bert Hopwood, who will spend the next 4 decades working with Turner and against him, and documenting all of it in a memoir that reads like the minutes of a disaster. In 1937, Turner introduces the Speed Twin, 500 cubic centimeters, a parallel twin engine that is lighter, narrower, and faster than the single-cylinder machines every other British manufacturer is building. The engineering press is almost indignant. How has nobody done this before? The Speed Twin costs 75 pounds, 5 pounds more than the single it sits beside in the showroom. Testers record a mean top speed of 93 miles per hour, with a tailwind run of 107. The Tiger 100 follows in 1939. Every Triumph built for the next half-century, every Tiger, every Trophy, every Bonneville, descends from Turner's 1937 architecture. That formula, that engine, it's so right it will take 46 years and the death of a company to retire it. Turner is a stylist as much as an engineer. He understands, long before the marketing people catch up, that motorcycles are sold to men who first see them, then ride them. The curve of a tank, the chrome nacelle, the color of a Tiger 100 in a showroom window, all of it matters. In 1951, BSA Group acquires Triumph. BSA chairman Eric Turner, no relation to Edward, sees the motorcycle division as a cash machine for other ambitions. Steel, armaments, more respectable plays. Bert Hopwood later records that several executives at senior level were openly contemptuous of the product. Motorcycles embarrassed them. The men on the factory floor don't know this yet. They're building the best motorcycle in the world. The Americans are about to say so very loudly. Act 2. America. The Second World War puts 250,000 American servicemen into Britain. They ride British motorcycles. They go home carrying something the American industry hasn't factored in: the memory of what a lighter, faster, better handling machine feels like in a corner. Harley-Davidson and Indian are still building machines designed in the early 1930s. Heavy frames, side valve engines, a riding posture that makes sense on a highway at 60 miles per hour and nowhere else. The returning GIs don't need convincing. They know. That knowledge moves through the culture, from veterans to friends, to younger brothers, to teenagers who have never sat on a Triumph but have heard repeatedly that something better exists. By 1953, the customer is forming. The Bonneville doesn't exist yet, but the bike that will carry its name is already being wanted. 1953. Marlon Brando rides a 1950 Triumph Thunderbird 6T in the Wild One. The studio knew he was a Triumph man. He stipulated in his contract he would ride his own bike. Nobody argued. The film gets banned in several American towns. The cultural halo is complicated, but the image is permanent. The most iconic biker silhouette in American cinema is on a British machine. Every poster of that film does the work of 1,000 advertisements over the following decade. James Dean buys a Triumph TR5 trophy to imitate Brando. The image moves through the culture like smoke. September 6, 1956, a 15-foot fiberglass streamliner called the Texas Cigar, piloted by Johnny Allen of Fort Worth, runs across the Bonneville Salt Flats. Two-way average, 214 miles per hour, powered by a stock-based 650 cubic centimeter Triumph engine. The AMA certifies it as a world motorcycle speed record. The international governing body refuses to ratify it, a political dispute about timing credentials. Edward Turner's response is characteristic. He orders every Triumph leaving the factory-stamped world motorcycle speed record holder, in open contempt of the international body. One of the team later said Turner admitted they got more publicity from being unapproved than they would have if it had been approved. 3 years later, Turner names his new 649 cubic centimeter flagship after the place where the record was set. the Bonneville T120. It goes on sale in 1959. Twin Amal carburetors, 46 horsepower at 6,500 revolutions per minute. Many road tests called it the fastest production motorcycle available. American riders who try one for the first time say it feels like they've been riding something wrong until now. The corners come at the bike and the bike accepts them without protest. It's narrow, it's light. By 1960, every American Triumph dealer who can get hold of T120S is selling everyone he can get. On the West Coast, Bill Johnson's Johnson Motors in Pasadena covers 19 western states, personally selected dealers, personally trained mechanics. On the East Coast, the Triumph Corporation covers everything from Maine to Texas, out of Baltimore. Between them, by the mid-1960s, they account for the largest national export market Triumph has ever had. 1963, Steve McQueen stars in The Great Escape, a genuine motorcyclist. He chooses a 1962 Triumph TR6 trophy because a Triumph is what a serious rider rides. The production's insurers won't let him do the fence jump himself. His stunt double is Bud Ekins, a Sherman Oaks Triumph dealer and multi-time off-road champion, who calculates an 80-mile-per-hour run-up will clear the 12-foot wire to the landing 65 feet away. He's paid roughly $1,000. The sequence becomes one of the most copied images in cinema. The bike is a Triumph TR6. The jump is real. The wire is real. July 29, 1966. Bob Dylan crashes his Triumph Tiger T100 on the back roads near Woodstock, New York. He withdraws from public touring for nearly 8 years. By the mid-1960s, Triumph and BSA together dominate the American market above 500 cubic centimeters. AMA flat-track racing runs on British machinery. Harley dealers in California watch their customers walk past. The young buyers, the ones who will define motorcycle culture for a generation, aren't stopping. Harley-Davidson's sales collapse through the 1960s. Year after year, market share migrates to British machines. In 1969, the founding families accept a takeover from AMF, American Machine and Foundry, a manufacturer of bowling equipment and leisure products, for roughly $22 million. They take it because there's no better offer at any price that makes business sense. The company that will, 50 years later, market itself as the global symbol of American freedom needs a bowling company to survive in 1969, and the men in Birmingham still cannot see what they have on their hands. If you grew up knowing what a British twin sounds like, if you remember when a Bonneville parked on your street meant something, drop a comment with the year and the model, and subscribe, because stories like this one disappear if nobody remembers them. Act 3, the crate from Japan. The same week the American distributors ship their highest volume Triumph order in history, a crate arrives at a Los Angeles dockyard from Japan. Nobody at Meriden knows what's inside it. Honda launches the CB750 in 1969. 4 cylinders, a single overhead camshaft, a hydraulic front disc brake, the first on any mainstream production motorcycle. Electric start, press the button, it works. Every morning, in any weather. It launches in America at $1,495. The Bonneville costs more. The Honda didn't leak oil. The Triumph did. And American buyers noticed. They honestly believed their customers would stay loyal. But sincere belief doesn't win against a cheaper bike that starts with a button. But here's what makes it worse. The British weren't ambushed. In 1960, 9 years before the CB750, Edward Turner himself traveled to Japan. He visited Honda's factory. He saw automated production lines running at 30,000 units a month, more than Triumph's entire annual output. He documented it all in a formal report to the BSA board, acknowledging the staggering efficiency of what he'd seen. And then he concluded that the Japanese would likely remain confined to small displacement commuter machines, that they would never build a large capacity bike capable of challenging a 650 cubic centimeter British twin. He saw the future. He documented the threat, and then dismissed it. He saw the enemy, he filed the report, and he walked away. Meanwhile, inside BSA Group, a different failure was building in parallel. In 1962, Bert Hopwood and Doug Hell, 2 of the finest motorcycle engineers in Britain, began designing a new 750 cubic centimeter triple. With a 1967 launch, a British triple reaches America 2 full years ahead of Honda's 4. It did not launch in 1967. Management handed the styling to an industrial design firm with no motorcycle experience. The resulting bodywork was so disliked by riders and dealers that even the engineers were embarrassed. The Triumph Trident and BSA Rocket 3 finally shipped in late 1968. Within its first full production run, Honda sold roughly 30,000 CB750s. The Trident and Rocket 3 combined sold around 7,000. While management chased the triple, the parallel twin, the actual cash engine, the bike Americans actually wanted, was getting no investment. The Bonneville didn't need a successor. It needed a 5-speed gearbox, an electric starter, and a bottom end that didn't leak. It got none of those things. The men with the checkbook were building the wrong bike, and the Bonneville aged in real time on American showroom floors. Then the oil and frame happened. For the 1971 model year, management decided to answer the Honda problem with a brand new chassis. A single large diameter spine tube doubling as the oil reservoir, modern on paper. When the first engines arrived at the Meriden assembly line, they didn't fit. The rocker boxes hit the spine. Nobody had checked. The design office, a country house outside Birmingham staffed mainly by aerospace engineers who had never built a motorcycle, had produced a chassis without confirming the engine would go inside it. Meriden's response was to fetch the oxyacetylene torches and the hammers, and relieve each frame by hand until the engine could be persuaded in. Bikes reached American dealers with hammer marks on the frame spine, and a seat height nearly 2 inches taller than the previous year. Too tall for shorter riders to flat foot at a traffic light. This is the moment the legend of British engineering precision dies. Not on a racetrack, not at the salt flats. In the assembly bay, with men beating a chassis with a hammer because the company that designed it never checked whether the engine would fit inside. In 1971, the BSA Group reported a catastrophic loss of £8.5 million. £3 million of that bled directly from the motorcycle division. In March 1973, BSA shares collapse on the London Stock Exchange. Trading is suspended. 63 years of British motorcycle manufacturing history end on a stock ticker. The British government cannot allow the entire industry to fold. A man is appointed to fix it. His name is Dennis Poore. Act 4. The man with the spreadsheet. Dennis Poore is not a motorcycle man. Cambridge engineering graduate, former RAF wing commander, Formula One driver, 4th place at the 1952 British Grand Prix, British hill climb champion of 1950. He's also chairman of Manganese Bronze Holdings, a conglomerate whose method is to acquire failing firms, extract the value, and close what doesn't perform. He has absolute authority over Britain's greatest motorcycle brands. He has no interest in the people whose lives depend on him getting it right. In 1973, Norton Villiers Triumph NVT is formally constituted. The government puts in £4.8 million. Workers receive assurances. The word used is rescue. Within weeks, Poore's assessment team finishes their review. Meriden, the factory that has built the Bonneville for a generation, that employs approximately 1,700 people, that is the reason the village of Meriden exists as an industrial community, is to close. Production consolidates at Birmingham's Small Heath plant. Poore looked at Meriden and saw numbers. The workers looked at it and saw their lives. On Friday, the 14th of September, 1973, Poore visits Meriden for the first time as NVT chairman. He announces the closure, refuses questions, urgent meeting in London, and leaves. The workforce does something with no precedent in British industrial history. They don't walk out. They don't strike. They chain the factory gates shut from the inside. Behind those gates, approximately £10 million in finished Bonnevilles and Tigers, built, tested, ready to ship, that NVT cannot touch, cannot sell, cannot account for to its shareholders, and the specialist tooling to build the Triumph Trident, all of it locked inside. When Poore tries to restart Trident production at Small Heath, his engineers can't replicate the line. The tooling has to be redesigned from scratch. Around £3 million. Not spent saving the business, but spent recreating equipment he walked away from in his haste. Poore has shot his own balance sheet. NVT cuts the gas supply, banking on cold weather, doing what the lawyers cannot. The workers rig their own heating from scrap, get a generator running, set up gate duty rotas, test fire engines on the line regularly. And when we win, not if, this factory will be ready. Food comes over the gates. Miners, electricians, car workers from other factories arrive in solidarity. Collection tins at football grounds across the Midlands. Donations from trade unions in Australia. A local baker drops off bread every morning and refuses to be paid. 5 weeks in, on October 19, 1973, the Arab nations embargo the West. Oil rises from $2.90 a barrel to $11.65 overnight. British inflation tears toward 25%. Heath's government imposes the 3-day week. The country is barely holding together. American dealers stop waiting. They call Honda instead. Some never call NVT back. The standoff lasts 18 months. Act 5, the co-operative. Harold Wilson's Labor government returns in early 1974. A deal is brokered. In March 1975, the Meriden workforce receives a government loan of £4.2 million, plus a grant of £750,000. They use it to buy the factory and tooling from NVT outright. The Meriden Motorcycle Cooperative is formed. The people who refuse to let the Bonneville die will now build it themselves. For a moment, genuinely, briefly, it works. Production quality that impresses American visitors. Workers making decisions by democratic vote. Walk into an American dealership in 1979. On one side, a row of Japanese machines. Disc brakes front and rear, electric start, 6 speeds, overhead camshafts, engines that don't leak. On the other side, the Bonneville T120. Beautiful, charismatic, needing a kickstart, still leaving a patch on the floor. There's no research and development budget, none. The engine they're building, a stretched version of Turner's 1937 architecture, cannot be updated because there's no money to update it. The men actually worked harder for themselves than they ever did for the shareholders. The quality is there. The pride is there. But no amount of pride bridges a 30-year technology gap. The last Meriden Bonneville rolls off the line in August 1983. The gates are locked for the final time, from the outside. In 1983, a Derbyshire property developer named John Bloor buys the Triumph name from the receiver for £150,000. He builds a new factory at Hinckley, Leicestershire. New engineers, new engines designed from scratch, using the exact manufacturing philosophies that Turner had observed in Japan in 1960 and dismissed. Horizontal case splits, automated production, precision at volume, everything Turner saw and walked away from. The first Hinckley motorcycles roll out in 1991. The Bonneville nameplate returns in 2001. Today, Triumph builds over 140,000 motorcycles a year. The Phoenix is real. But a phoenix rises from ashes. It is not the same bird. Close your eyes. Hear the parallel twins firing on the assembly line. 80 Bonnevilles a day, bound for California, for Route 66, for a parking lot outside a Harley dealership in 1967, where someone is about to ride past and feel ashamed of his own machine. Open your eyes. The street sign reads, Bonneville Close. For 15 years, this village made the greatest thing in the world. The world knew it. They let it go. If you owned a Triumph, worked on one, or knew someone who did, drop the year and the model in the comments. The Bonneville, the TR6, the Tiger, the Trident. These details are why this channel exists. And subscribe. Because stories like this one disappear if nobody remembers them.